Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hi, this is Arlene. We are back again with our ABC Dialogue.
Hi, this is Gowri, and today we have a guest who is joining us all the way from Singapore.
Hey, Imran, Tajudeen, how are you?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm
How
good,
are you
thanks.
today?
How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you
Okay, good.
very clearly. Today, you are going to talk about a project that you started quite a few months back, probably last year, if I'm not mistaken. And the project is pretty interesting because it's about 19th century Singapore.
Yep, that's right.
So maybe just a bit of background about why you started this project and where you come from.
Okay. There's a bit of a background to the whole story. We're talking about, of course, the project for Jalan Kubur, or actually a cemetery along Victoria Street in a part of Singapore called Kampung Glam, which is the old Malay-Muslim quarter of Singapore. And so this is a Muslim cemetery that dates back at least to the 19th century, possibly slightly earlier than that. And actually, interest in the site, for me personally, dates way back. As part of my study on Kampung Glam, the port town I was talking about, the overall history of that port town. And this cemetery is actually an integral part of a 19th century town that was laid out in about 1819 when Raffles decided, that he would install Tengku Long from Riau, the elder prince of the Sultan in Riau, as the king in Singapore, so that he could legitimately set up a factory, an English factory in Singapore. I think for Malaysians there might be some familiarity with this story.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the setting up of that port town, the Jalan Kubur as a cemetery became part of this new town that was developed. So that's the background to the why Kampung Glam interested me back in 2004, 2005. But how this particular project started is more recent, and it's got to do with the fact that the cemetery is not included in the heritage district of Kampung Glam. So in Singapore, we designate heritage districts, official ones. So although Jalan Kubur is part of Kampung Glam historically, it is not included in the heritage district. And inside Kampung Glam, there is a heritage center called the Malay Heritage Center. It actually sits inside of the Istana, or the former royal palace of the Sultan who was installed, the one I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So Malay Heritage Center, or MHC, so we'll refer to it as MHC, became interested in looking at the cemetery, and documenting it. So it finally got formalized last year in the form of what we call an ITQ, an invitation to quote from National Heritage Board for a project to document it.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to quickly put together a team, and then we had to set up a kind of consultancy. And then we bid for it, and fortunately we got the bid. So it's not, you might hear from certain newspaper articles that we were commissioned to do it. That's not true. We actually had to quickly put together a team and bid for this invitation to quote.
How many teams were bidding for it besides yours?
There were 3 others.
Mm-hmm.
There were 3 others, and the interesting thing is that this is the first time, as far as I know, that there is a bid. There is a call, rather, to document a 19th century Muslim cemetery. And so none of the teams had any prior experience, of course. And of course, the kind of knowledge required to document it also would not be with them. So although we were a new team and we were competing with others who had done previous research, let's put it that way, not even field research. So we were doing field research on site. The other teams so it's really interesting for the team when we're talking about the project, that we had to take up such a challenging site documentation project. Yeah, so for all of us, it was quite an experience going through this,
Mm-hmm.
especially those of us working on site. Yeah.
You are an assistant professor at National University of Singapore, and the area that you are teaching is mainly about architecture.
That's right.
So what makes you interested to be in a project that is mostly about history and culture rather than architecture?
Okay, I guess two things. One is, as I mentioned, the cemetery, Jalan Kubur Cemetery, or the cemetery at Victoria Street, is an integral component of the port town I mentioned earlier. And the port town, the urban history of that port town has been my research area for quite some time. So it's very related to my line of research in a particular part of Singapore, namely Kampong Glam and the 19th century history of Kampong Glam. So that's the first reason. The second reason is I've always been fascinated by the artifact histories of Southeast Asia, of Nusantara. So actually, in 1999, I started a project, a small research project to look into what is called Batu Aceh. These are gravestones produced by what is today Aceh. At that time, it was Pasai. Those of us who are familiar with Malacca history, Kesultanan Malacca, Sultanate of Malacca, would know Malacca had relations with an even older Muslim port called Pasai in the region of what is today Aceh. The interesting thing about Pasai and Aceh is that they produced a tradition of Islamic tombstones that amalgamated different traditions of Hindu-Buddhist formal traditions in the Straits region and from Java. So, the early tombstone forms adopted and reworked many of these old, what we call Indic or Hindu-Buddhist, Malay and Javanese motifs into Islamic tombstones. So I already had that fascination. And when you look at Jalan Kubur's tombstones, they are actually 19th century pared down, if you like, or kind of simplified renditions, versions of these Batu Aceh tombstones. But the story doesn't end there, because there is a great variety of tombstone types in Jalan Kubur, not just 19th century versions of Batu Aceh, which date all the way back from the 1300s, 1200s, 1400s. For example, all the tombstones of the kings of Malacca were in the Batu Aceh tradition, which means they date back to the 1400s and early 1500s, for example. Not just that, beyond the Batu Aceh tradition in Jalan Kubur, you also find tombstones from all sorts of other traditions, beyond the Southeast Asian Batu Aceh tradition. So those are the two reasons why it would interest me personally. And I wouldn't say I can speak on behalf of the other consultants and volunteers, but I know that many of them are interested in it for related reasons. So, for example, they're interested in the site, even though none of them are actually, specialists in, say, art history. They're interested in saving or protecting or finding out more about a historic site. Yeah.
So based on all your findings and all these different tombstones and all, what does that tell you about maybe the aspects of the Malay Muslim society in Singapore?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting to talk about at this juncture, because I've been talking so much about tombstones, which are artifacts. So artifacts are but signposts of the society that produced them. And in this case, as I was saying, besides the Batu Aceh tradition, you have diverse numbers of other traditions, which included Javanese tombstone types. They also date back very far to the time of Majapahit. And what most people forget is Majapahit and Malacca were contemporaries. So while Majapahit was there, Majapahit was already quite old, and Malacca came up, emerged as an important port. Now, while Malacca would use Batu Aceh, if you go to Majapahit, there were Muslims in even the capital of Majapahit, which, as we know, was Buddhist and Hindu. So even though Majapahit itself was Buddhist and Hindu, the Muslim traders in that the capital, there were Muslim traders, and they used tombstones that reworked Javanese motifs. We were very astonished.
When you say Muslim, you don't. It's not necessarily Malay Muslim. Right.
No, of course not. They were in Java. Many of them would have been Javanese, and some of them would have been foreigners. Foreigners meaning it would have included Malays, and it may have included, for example, Gujarati Muslims or Tamil Muslims,
How
Persian
diverse?
or Iranian,
Yeah, how
James
diverse were the
Arabs.
Muslim at that period of time?
How what again?
How diverse were the Muslim traders
Oh,
or
very
the
diverse.
or the
Actually,
Muslim
diversity
community?
has existed in the port towns of the region since the Hindu-Buddhist period. So if you look at old Javanese inscriptions from before Majapahit, that means the time of Mataram Kuna, they call it, or Old Mataram, then you would see that there are references made to traders of diverse Asian origins, from various regions of South Asia, various regions of East Asia, of course, various regions of mainland and island Southeast Asia. So diversity has always been a part of Southeast Asian port cities, including in the pre-Islamic period. But we're talking about the transition between the Hindu-Buddhist period and the Islamic period in Java. Although we are straying far from the topic of Jalan Kubor, it's still relevant because when you come back to Jalan Kubor, as I mentioned, you find these Javanese tombstones. And these Javanese tombstones display precisely that adaptation or reworking of pre-Islamic Javanese motifs into Islamic tombstones that we first observed in 14th century Java, in other words, the time of Majapahit, and in the Majapahit capital. So it's a tradition. I'm not saying the tombstones date from that period, but that tradition is found in Singapore. Quite a number of such tombstones, about a dozen of them. And what this means is that, firstly, of course, you have the issue of, okay, so who carved these tombstones? You have Javanese type tombstones. Besides Javanese type tombstones, we know there were Javanese traders in 19th century Singapore. There were many.
Mm-hmm.
There were many, and they were important. We know that. In addition, we also have tombstones in Jalan Kubor that were Ottoman in profile. In other words, Ottoman Turkey, 19th
You
century
mean it come
versions.
all the way from that area, Ottoman Turkey?
What I'm saying is the profile.
Okay.
In other words, it may have been carved in Singapore or nearby, but the profile that it assumes is that of Ottoman Turkish tombstones. And then there is also now we've already mentioned three so far, Batu Aceh traditions of slab and pillar type. So there are many different shapes when you talk about Batu Aceh tradition, which is Sumatran Malay, Sumatran, the peninsula, and it's spread as far as Borneo. And then you have the Javanese tradition, also quite a number of different shapes, not just one shape. And then you have the Ottoman tradition, which is the examples found in Jalan Kubor are rather simplified versions of the Ottoman types, but you can recognize the profile nonetheless. And then you also have tombstone shapes for which no known precedent exists as far as we know. If you refer to books that talk about tombstone shapes in Southeast Asia, you realize that some of the tombstones found in Jalan Kubor are unique. They've not, they don't fall into any particular tradition. They don't fall into any classification. And most of these, well, in fact, I would say all of these tombstones that have these unique, unseen before shapes belong to Bugis merchants. We also know, besides the Javanese, that Bugis merchants were very important in Singapore and lived in the Kampung Glam area. So all in all, when we're looking at Kampung Glam's, the evidence of Kampung Glam society in 19th century Singapore, by looking at these gravestones, we really get a very fascinating picture of diversity. And, you of course, already the tombstones are fascinating. But what they say about society in Kampung Glam in the 19th century, and therefore, by implication, Singapore, is really quite fascinating for us. Yeah.
Interesting that you mentioned a lot of different history background. About besides the society there, what else that you observe based on your research at the Muslim cemetery in Jalan Kubor?
Oh yes, I've been talking also only about the tombstone profile. I did not mention the scripts.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the inscriptions on the tombstones, now we documented altogether over 4,700 pairs of gravestones. As you know, in Muslim burial, you have a pair, a headstone and a footstone. Sometimes they are raised on a kind of pedestal, which is called the dapur-dapur. The dapur-dapur can be simple, it can be very complex and tall. There may, in some cases, be an enclosure of a low wall or a high wall. There may also be a pavilion. So we found all these structures on site, of course. Not that when I say we found, we've already known and seen these structures even before the official project began. Yeah. So many of us, I kind of said this at the beginning. Many of us who joined the team or whom I put together in the team are there because they were already interested in the site. Many, not all, but many of them were already interested in the site before the project began. So when I say we saw it, it means that we know that it was there, and then now we really document it. So going further, besides these forms, there were also the inscriptions, as I mentioned. The inscriptions are very interesting. You get Bugis inscriptions, Bugis script. So the Bugis, people from South Sulawesi, have their own writing, their own system of writing. It's called it depends. If you want to be very specific, the script is called Sulapat Epak, which means the four-sided script. Epak is empat. So in Bugis, Epak is empat. So Sulapat Epak means the four-sided script. You find the four-sided script, or some people call it lontara. Lontara actually refers to the palm leaf manuscript. So some people just call it the lontara script. So you find the lontara script there on the tombstones. There is a format by which they appear. They will always appear on the footstone. The headstone is for Jawi and Arabic. So you do find, of course, by default, I forgot to mention, obviously we would expect Jawi.
Yeah, Jawi was the lingua franca of that period, wasn't it?
Yes. Jawi, not Jawi is a script. So Malay was the lingua franca. Yes, you're right. But Jawi is the script. So Jawi is the modified form of the Arabic script used to write Malay. And so, of course,
at the time, the Romanized Malay were not introduced yet.
Not yet. Although you do find a few examples where the year is written in European numerals as opposed to Arabic numerals. Because that's surprising, because you have Jawi script, and then usually accompanying Jawi script or Arabic script, which either one, you would find Arabic numerals, right, instead of European numerals. But there are cases where you find European numerals being used instead. So that was also quite interesting. So besides Bugis script, we also have 3 examples of tombstones with Javanese script. So the Javanese also have their own writing system, and it's called, today the modern form is called Hanacaraka, which is something like what we call the alphabet, because it's alpha, beta, A and B. Alpha is A, beta is B, isn't it? So alphabet, and so they call it Hanacaraka, which is the 5 first letters in their alphabet. Hanacaraka. So Hanacaraka. So yeah, you also find Javanese Hanacaraka there. And then let me see now. I've mentioned Bugis and Javanese and of course Jawi. We also found Gujarati. That's right. One example of Gujarati script. Gujarat, of course, is in northwest India, next to Pakistan. That's the province, and of course, not of course. So the Gujarati script was for a tombstone in an area which had one more tombstone also of the burial of a Gujarati person, except that this other Gujarati person had the inscription in Arabic script, but not in the Arabic language. So Arabic was being used to write Gujarati language. Just like how Arabic script is modified to be used to write Malay language, Arabic script has been used to write all sorts of other languages like Iranian languages and so on. So this particular one was interesting because you had 2 Gujarati tombstones of Gujarati persons.
I see.
One of
Were
it
there any
uses
Persian people? Those with
yes,
Persian background?
Well, we can't be very sure, but actually, if you say Persian, probably not. But if you say people of Shia background, then yes, of course.
So when you say Shia background, how do you verify that they came from that particular religious sect?
Their surnames.
Their surnames.
It's from their surnames. Sorry, it's from their surnames. So
what were the
even
surnames?
today, those surnames are borne by people who are from the Shia sect. Yeah. And then besides that, you also have names that indicate place of origin. So since we're talking about northwest India just now, Gujarat, you also have Al-Hindi, which means you're from North India, Al-Hindi. Or it could be just Hind refers to India. Although typically when you say Al-Hindi, you're referring to North India. You also have people who, bear appellations Banja, which means you are from Banjarmasin in South Borneo, which was Banjarmasin was an important trade port. So Banja, and then you have Bawean, which means they are from Bawean Island. There are Baweanese.
South Borneo meaning Kalimantan?
That's right, South Borneo. South Borneo facing Java, you have Banjarmasin. So the people from Banjarmasin are called Banja. So you have a few, more than one. Was it 2 or 3 tombstones that had the name Banja then? And of course, there are a lot of Banja merchants buried in Jalan Kubor. Now, there's just too much to mention. So the Banjarmasin merchants in Kampung Glam, those from Banjarmasin in South Borneo or South Kalimantan,
So,
they were not just diamond merchants, but they were famous. There's at least one particular family that and sub branches of the family who dealt with diamonds. So these diamond merchants are also buried in the Jalan Kubor cemetery, and they operated their businesses in Kampung Glam, the town right next to the cemetery.
So, we talk a lot about the background, background profile of all those who were buried at the cemetery in Jalan Kubor. But what about the social economic background of these people? Were they from a certain social class, or were they a cemetery for all types of classes of society, a Muslim society within that period of time? What were your discoveries?
It was the latter, the second. Which means that you have a very diverse profile of people buried there. I mentioned that there's more than 4,700 inscriptions. Out of these 4,700 plus, only about 400 are inscribed, which means 10%. So that I don't know whether you think the percentage is valid, but usually you call the elite you consider it about 10%, but it's not as straightforward as that. There are many large tombstones that surprisingly do not bear inscriptions. So we know these large tombstones are more expensive to produce, so most likely, these are from people of a higher economic class. I wouldn't say social class, you wouldn't know. So there's no direct correspondence. There are small gravestones with inscriptions, and then there are large gravestones with no inscriptions. But when we just talk about inscriptions, only 10% are inscribed with names and dates, or all sorts of other manner of information. So socio-economic class, you have also not just economic class, maybe social class. You have royalty buried there.
You mean
of course,
the royalty,
the royal family of
Singapore?
Not just Singapore.
Oh, Johor.
Yeah, you have not Johor, but people from Selangor, and I don't know whether you would recall, but in 2004, Nga Ibrahim was exhumed from Jalan Kubor Cemetery and brought back to Perak. Nga Ibrahim, who is famous in the history of Perak, so he was buried in Singapore actually. Nga Ibrahim.
So
By the way, there are also royalty from Selangor buried in Jalan Kubor, for example. These for various reasons. How persons of royal birth moved across cities in the Straits region and even beyond. So it should come as no surprise. In the 19th century, people were more mobile than today, ironically. Because,
they don't have visa.
Fascinatingly, they don't need it because
they don't have visa, and people in the past it seems to be more diverse than we have today. From the identity diverse. That you mentioned.
Yeah, no, we're still diverse, but we just don't know it. I think your previous program, the person who you interviewed previously pointed this out, that if there's a wish for for Malaysia from him, it is for everyone. And this would extend to where I live, Singapore. I'm from Singapore, so for people today to still acknowledge, understand the diversity that exists around them still today. I mean, both you and I are of diverse birth. We know this because we are friends. But maybe most people would flatten our identity, to just one of the known labels. So if there's anything that Kampung Glam can teach us in Singapore, it is to remember how diverse we are, of such diverse origins and with such diverse expressions, even in the case of tombstones and tombstone inscriptions. Yeah.
So anyway,
And this I don't even think I have time to mention the kind of carvings that appeared there.
Yeah.
So many different traditions of carvings as well.
So anyway, we have to take a short break, but when we return, we will have more discussion from you. I'm sure you have a lot of things to share.
Okay.
ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hey, this is Arlene, and we are back again with our guest today, Imran Tajudeen, and together with me is.
It's Gowri. I'm still here.
So we discussed a lot, and you were very enthusiastic in terms of the culture of those who were buried at the Muslim cemetery at Jalan Kubur, and also the background of the 19th century Singapore, especially around the area of Kampong Glam. But at the same time, I'm just wondering, like, prior to your research,
Yes.
who were the custodian of the Muslim cemeteries?
Yes, thank you for giving me a chance to explain that. That's very important. The cemetery site is actually within the boundaries of the royal town. So initially, of course, it would be owned by the royal family. But the royal family also divided the plot into three parts. So the one on the left, the largest plot, was put under the custodianship of the Aljunaid family. The Aljunaid they are Hadramaut or Hadrami Arab clan. So that's the surname, Aljunaid. So they took care of that side of the cemetery, maintained burial records, and created a wakaf for the upkeep of the graves. That was until early 2000s when the Singapore government ended that arrangement. So the Aljunaids could no longer, even with that wakaf, they could no longer take care. So besides that first part, you have the second part, which is, the royal area. So we could call it the main part because, as I mentioned, the cemetery was initially owned by the royal family, the Sultan. So this second part is where you find a very large, prominent raised mound where the members of the royal family are buried, except the first two sultans, both of whom incidentally were buried in Malacca. But most of the other descendants, besides the third sultan, who is buried in Sultan Mosque, are buried in this royal mound, and there are other graves next to and surrounding the royal mound. They are mostly of commoners, although you would find one or two aristocrats also buried there. So that's the second part. And then the third part is behind what is called Malabar Mosque. Malabar, as you know, is that part of southern India which is facing the Arabian Sea, not the Tamil Nadu coast, which faces us, Sumatra, Malaya, but the other side that faces the Arabian Sea. So Malabaris, behind the Malabar Mosque is a strip of land of the cemetery that was initially bequeathed by the Sultan for Tamil Muslim merchants. However, it was not actually used by the Tamil Muslim community. Instead, the land there was bought for burial by a number of Bugis and Banja merchants, very wealthy families who were among the most well-to-do in the Kampong Glam town. The most wealthy families of Bugis and Banja descent, Bugis, and Banja, just now from Banjarmasin, buried their ancestors there. So those are the three parts. So the third part, that's mainly under the Bugis and Banja families that I mentioned, although there are other burials there. So overall, you can see that it's split into three, although you can just look at the cemetery as one. If you really understood the custodianship, then you can look at it as three parts. Yeah.
And what about in terms of preserving this history, these discoveries that you guys found?
Actually, that's kind of what triggered the concern in the first place for the site. For me personally, as well as all the members of the team, whom are also given to understand that in the official master plan, the cemetery is actually not under protection. It is zoned for residential housing. So that, of course, that has been the case for a long time. And unfortunately, I mentioned the alginates. So the alginate graves were actually exhumed already in 2005. The alginates buried their ancestors in two mausoleum-like buildings, two sheltered buildings. All the graves inside these two buildings have been exhumed already in 2005. So that's quite scary for us. Fortunately for all of us, I shouldn't even use the word fortunately, because the alginate family tombs have been exhumed. So there's nothing fortunate about this. But maybe, good for us that the rest of the cemetery is still there. So, right now we are really hoping that through this documentation, there will be an interest to reverse the whole decision and to protect the cemetery. We really, really are interested in documenting only insofar as it will help in furthering the cause of saying this is a very important site. It has to be preserved in situ. No such thing as, digital documentation heritage or whatever other kind of ideas about putting the tombstones into a special commemorative park and exhuming the rest. No such thing. As far as the team is concerned, we are only interested in this because we feel the site itself is worthy of preservation. Once you lose the site, you lose the overall sense of what it was like to have a cemetery next to a 19th century port town.
Right now,
This is very rare.
it is actually in an area that is open, that anyone can come in and
That's right, it's public.
That anyone can come in and somehow it will risk being destroyed by either nature or by human beings.
I see. Natural. That's the problem, because, the problem is created only now because, as I said previously, there was a custodianship. That custodianship has been broken. Yeah. So it's kind of saying, oh no, now it's broken. Yeah, it's broken because you broke it.
So
it wasn't broken before. So we have come to this. So something needs to be done about reviving that. Or come on, there are many parks. In any country there will be parks. Who maintains the parks? Yeah, it is the state that maintains these parks. So it is about here the will of the state to maintain places of public amenity. So this isn't a question of whether something is open and going to be vulnerable. For that matter, then all parks are open and vulnerable. Then the same measures that we use to protect parks are to be used to protect the cemetery park. Yeah.
So, apart from feeling like this is actually a site worth preserving, is there any other important reason why documenting this whole finding is so important?
Thank you. Beyond the historical worth and interest, of course, we're talking here about, as we mentioned earlier, this is a history of diversity, a history of cosmopolitanism, and a history intimately tied to the people who formerly lived in Kampung Glam and its surrounding areas. And of course, if you project it larger, this is a document of the history of the Malays and Muslims of Singapore. Even when I use the word Malay here, of course, it's very diverse. As we mentioned, it's not Bugis, Banjar. So we're talking about a history that is about identity. And it is about identities in the plural that have been overlooked or forgotten and flattened mostly.
Right now, when it comes to identity, what is the association of Singaporean identity when it comes to like the understanding of race or culture?
Yeah, it's flattened. So there's what we call the CMIO formula: Chinese, Malay, Indian, others.
It's similar to Malaysia, it seems like.
Yes, of course, because we are actually one country, aren't we? We just have political boundaries. So, it's the same CMIO as well. Although in Malaysia you wouldn't put C in front, I suppose. You probably put MCIO. But it's the same. Nowadays in Singapore it's becoming MIOC, I think. CIOM, whatever. Whichever way it's scrambled, it's still CMIO. So the problem is it's very flat. It doesn't acknowledge the diversity that you would expect from the Straits region, the Straits of Malacca. And it's not just Singapore. You go to all the other port towns of the region, it's the same. So that's to me the worth of the cemetery as a record of that. Besides, of course, the obvious artifactual and historical importance, it is that the stuff it is made of, that it points to that past, that social economic past. You're talking about economic past, of course. You're talking about here another aspect which is interesting, that of Malayo-Nusantara merchants. Because in the narrative, the typical narrative of Singapore history, we never talk about Malay merchants. They don't seem to exist. We have one token person mentioned, always Haja Fatima, the Malay merchant from Malacca, who's actually of Bugis descent, who built a mosque, in the demolished part of Kampung Glam. But we don't have any other names besides that. The cemetery, on the other hand, contains so many names of these Malayo-Nusantara merchants. So that's another very important reason why it should be preserved, and it should really be integrated into the Kampung Glam Heritage District. Because really, without that cemetery, the Heritage District would lose so much of why it is an important part of early Singapore history.
And talking about Kampung Glam, what were the culture back then, the whole Kampung Glam culture back in the 19th century? When you said there were a lot, through your discovery at the Muslim cemetery, there were a lot of traders. So I would suspect that Kampung Glam were once a trading port that is full of, people of different society coming together.
It was a merchant port town, yes. Yeah. So it was of course many things, as in all towns. You have the full spectrum of people, right? Not all of them would be wealthy, not all of them would be merchants, but they would have included the merchants, the key merchants of the port town, many of whom were Bugis and Javanese.
And the Istana is at Kampung Glam itself as well,
that's
I suspect.
Right. The center of the walled town, which included, there was a walled town, but it was already taken apart by 1824. So that's very early. It was established in 1819 and then taken apart already by 1824. And then today you only see the innermost core, only the palace grounds, at the reduced palace grounds, if you go to the Malay Heritage Center today. But back to the composition of the port town, the socio-economic structure. So you have, of course, the royal town and royalty at the center of a walled area. Around it, in the early British documents, we know that there were 20, there was an exact number given, 20 in the British documents, Bugis compounds of Bugis merchants. These compounds were large ones because this was the old social system, where each chief merchant had his followers living around him. So it constituted its own kampung. When this was taken apart and reorganized by the British, it was reorganized into streets. And so you have shop houses. So the merchants of Kampung Glam, whether they were Malay, Bugis, Javanese, they lived in shop houses by the middle of the 19th century. Yeah, so you have the full spectrum. Like I said, you have merchants, you have workers of the merchants. You would in the pre-19th century history, you would even call the people who work for the merchants their inverted commas slaves, meaning they were the workers. It's a patron-client relationship, traditional society. So you have that. Many more of
coolie
those
at that time when you say slaves.
Sorry, not the kind of slavery. That's why I say inverted commas. The slavery that happened in Southeast Asia, it's not the same as the slavery you would imagine in, say, Europe and North America. Not that kind of slaves. Not black slaves either. They are all, just people of their own community, as well as people who have been captured. Like you have both actually. You have that bondsman. But we are straying far from the topic. Let me just summarize it by saying slavery in Southeast Asia is a very complex topic. You would have to read up about it to understand it. And there are many scholars who have written about it. For example, Anthony Reid. Yeah. But back to Kampung Glam social composition, you have the Javanese community, many of whom operated printing presses. Very important. Many of them operated printing presses whose books were sold throughout the archipelago. So if you look at the books that were circulating in the archipelago in the early 19th century up to the late 19th century, many of them would have printed in Singapore, in Jawi, of course.
I have another question. Since it's a Muslim cemetery, were there any Chinese or Hui Muslim being buried at the Muslim cemetery? Yes,
good question. Actually, I completely forgot. There is one very interesting gravestone. It has Chinese script on it.
Interesting.
On the footstone.
Were you
and below the Chinese script is Jawi. Although
wow.
I am not sure if the Jawi is in Malay or it's definitely not in Arabic, it seems. But what we are wondering is what language is it in. We have not been able to decipher. There's Jawi below it, and then on the headstone it's in English, and it's actually probably not a Hui Muslim,
So
If
it's a
you mean
Chinese
by-
Muslim of a
She
certain.
might not even have been Chinese.
I see.
Yeah, she might have been the
Central Asia.
Muslim wife of unknown ethnicity. We can't tell her ethnicity from the tombstone or from her name. Her name is Emma, E-M-M-A. We were wondering whether that's Emma or Emma.
Mm-hmm.
But the inscription was set up by her stepdaughter, Lim Chin Nyo. And we know that from the name Lim Chin Nyo, it is probably Peranakan Chinese. Yeah. So we have a lot of speculation about who this lady might be. Of course, firstly, the clue would be to find out who Lim Chin Nyo is now. The stepdaughter who set up the gravestones for her
Mm-hmm.
and the inscription.
Seems like
Yeah,
there's
so-
it's a huge project now. It's no longer just about uncovering
Of course.
the graves.
It
Now
hasn't
it's
ended,
about
yeah.
uncovering the identity of who are being buried behind
Yes.
the graves.
And even when we know who they are, there's still a lot to be done.
Mhm.
Even
So-
when we know who they are, like
So
even if we know their full
So
name.
who
yeah.
are part of your team?
Yes, thank you for providing me with the opportunity. The rest of the team here, let me just list out all the consultants who have contributed to various aspects of the documentation and to the final document as it was submitted. Besides myself, there is for mapping, Muhammad Yazid bin Salam; for historical documents, Muhammad Effendi Abdul Hamid; for site work and documentation, Khatijah Rajali; for database on a voluntary basis, we have Nazim Ibrahim; the director of the company who managed the finances, Khairul Arifin; for inscriptions, Muhammad Arafat; and for Bugis inscriptions in particular, Wafiuddin. Historical documents and sites, we have Muhammad Kamsha bin Hizib and Shamil bin Zainuddin. Under historical documents, Daniel Lin Go, and for database, Chen Kian Wee. We have the very, very important Madrasah Al-Junaid. You remember the Al-Junaids, huh? The Al-Junaid set up a madrasah next to the site where they were custodians of. Madrasah Al-Junaid alumni for Arabic inscriptions and on-site work. This was a very important component of the work. They were led by Ustazah Harina binti Abdul Latif, who is the assistant vice principal of the school. She coordinated the students. And then we have some key, very, very key volunteers: Shafiqah binti Ja'far, Isrizal bin Muhammad Isa, Azhar bin Kizir, Muhammad Shafi'i Shahmi, Chong Kai Siong, who assisted with the Chinese inscription, Khairul Anwar bin Sharifuddin, Muhammad Yusri bin Salam, Nurul Ain, and there are many other names that I cannot mention because there's just so many. And I mentioned the key volunteers as well as earlier the consultants and the Madrasah Al-Junaid alumni. So it's a very big team doing various components, and it was really, looking back, a very difficult project actually. Just imagine 4,700 over pairs of gravestones that we had to document.
And how long it
Just
took you?
imagine worn out grave inscriptions and all that. Yeah.
How long it took you to somehow to come
It
to
took us
this?
6 months.
6 months.
Altogether, from project beginning, clearing of site, what we call clustering of the graves, because the graves is not clearly discernible the kind of layout of the graves. Yeah. So we had to do what we call clustering, which was this method that I kind of devised. So we just take, say, about up to 16 pairs of gravestones. Even that was difficult to determine because sometimes we discovered more gravestones after we cleared the site, So we took roughly about 10 to 16 gravestones and made them into one cluster.
Mm-hmm.
So we started that in December until January. And then from January all the way until April, we were documenting the site. And April to May, we prepared the final document.
Yeah,
And then we
there's a
finally
long
submit.
way to go, and I
Yes.
guess you're only scratching the surface. There's a
Yeah.
much more deeper layer that you need to sort of uncover. Unfortunately, we are at the end of
Yes.
our show here.
Okay.
But before we end the show, I want to ask you, in conjunction with Malaysia Day, do you have any message or any wishes for Malaysians, or
Oh.
any information that you want to share about Malaysia Day?
Okay. We're not talking about the 1957 Malaya, right? Merdeka, right?
This is no.
Because you're talking about Malaysia Day, yeah?
The formation
Yes, right,
of
the one
Federation
coming
of
up. Because I
Malaysia.
remember some people called the 1957 one Malaysia Day, and then people are up in arms. That's not Malaysia Day, that is Hari Merdeka, Malaya Day. But anyway, so we are talking about Malaysia Day when Singapore joined along with Sabah and Sarawak, right, in 1963. Okay. What message do I have? This is unexpected. I guess maybe I'll just talk about this from the perspective of a Singaporean, okay? Because I wouldn't dare to speak on behalf of anybody else, just myself actually. Maybe despite, this is probably talking to the choir boys, because all of us are, of this kind of ilk. What I wanted to say is, despite all the bickering and the wayang that we see among our political leaders across the causeway, as we would put it, this especially goes out to Johorians, right? Because Johor would be more attuned to what's happening across the border than maybe someone from Perak. But despite all that bickering, I think you and I know that Singapore and Malaysia are two inseparable entities, despite the political division. So, whatever that, it's like the Malay saying, you pinch the right thigh, the left thigh will feel. So it's really part of the same body and the same body of people. So I hope that as Malaysia, we can see in Singapore, we can see the political developments taking place, especially in Indonesia, but also in Malaysia, the political maturation, the maturity and the kind of people-to-people relations that overcome all the political hubris, if you like. So I hope that in the future, the people-to-people relations between Malaysians and Singaporeans, these are of course again artificial division, would be stronger than what it is today, and would really overcome all the political bickering and hubris and all the wayang that we sometimes see. So, and I think Durian ASEAN has an even bigger project than that. It wants to unite all of ASEAN on a people-to-people basis. So I really, really commend you for doing this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing with us your view, and all the best for your Jalan Kubur project. We hope to hear more development in terms of how you can move forward in terms of trying to create a more diverse understanding of our diverse culture.